Okay, so we're going to do the first lecture in the civil rights movement, 1940s and 1950s. So you should follow along in your study guide and make sure you write down all the terms, try to get the definitions and significance for all of the things we talk about. So let's start off with the beginning of World War II. We have the government, a couple things that the government does to start desegregation. One is FDR in 1941 eliminates or forbids discrimination in hiring. So African Americans or any person of color can now get a job in the government without being discriminated against. So that's a step in the right direction. Kind of doesn't totally counterbalance his other executive order, which interned Japanese Americans, but he does one right thing and one wrong thing. After the war, Truman desegregates the military by executive order. So in 1947, for the first time in US history, African Americans and whites will fight together. Outside of the American Revolution and whatnot, but in the last 100 years, that African Americans will fight alongside whites in desegregated units. So the Korean War, Vietnam War, all the wars today, we're pretty much used to this by now, but it doesn't start until after World War II. I mean, you notice in this newspaper article, same time where he's desegregating the military, we have a posse bent on lynching under states' rights. So this is going to be a theme. States, when you hear the term states' rights, that usually means we want to maintain segregation in our racist policies. That's where it comes from. This comes after World War II. 2.5 million Black soldiers fight in World War II, so it's about time. And just like the government starts to take the lead on desegregation, sports starts to take the lead on desegregation. Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier in 1947 and becomes a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers. Goes on to, he's one of the greatest players of all time, and he is known for breaking this color barrier and is still celebrated today. There's Jackie Robinson Day, where all the players in the major leagues wear his number in honor of what he did, despite all the hardship he had to deal with, and the death threats and the other players trying to hurt him, and the people in the stands throwing racial insults at him. He still was able to perform and became Rookie of the Year that year, and was one of the Dodger greats. And we see later on, the NFL following suit. The NFL breaking the color barrier, Kenny Washington. The NBA breaking the color barrier with Nat Clifton. So all of our sports and our government take the first steps in desegregating America during the Jim Crow South, which was still going on since the 1800s. We're still in this era of segregation. And we also can see this reflected in our political parties. So this is the beginning of the split up of our two major parties. Democrat Harry Truman, the Republican Thomas E. Dewey in the 1948 presidential election. A third party breaks away from the Democrats and pulls Republicans in. They're known as the Dixiecrats, or the Southern Democrats, and it's led by Strom Thurmond. And Strom Thurmond is going to be representing this new states' rights platform. So again, if you look over here, you can pause this and look over here and see all the things that Republicans and Democrats actually agreed on. We live in a time where this is not the case, but back then they were pretty much on the same page with some small difficulties or differences, sorry. But this States' Rights Party, they have this whole little paragraph here that basically says we want segregation and the races shouldn't mix. So this is what they stand for: states' rights, racism. That's pretty much where we come down to. The rest of these major parties, or the two major parties, are kind of like, do we try to cater to this third party to try to bring them on board? What do we do? And it's reflected in the election. The States' Rights Party, there are 4 states. This is not a coincidence that they're all deep southern states, but you start to see this breakup of the Democratic Party, mainly because Truman and FDR had started these desegregation policies. So the Democrats had started to make these gains. Republicans were actually on the board for making some of these changes as well, but this throws a wrench in those plans. And so we're going to see which party adopts the states' rights party, or this third party. In 1954, we see the first major victory of the civil rights movement when the case Brown versus the Board of Education reaches the Supreme Court. And this was basically about school choice. African Americans lived in mixed communities, but they had to go to segregated schools. And they wanted the choice to go to the school that they wanted to go to. If there was a white school down the block, they wanted to be able to go to it instead of like across town. And so this court case is significant because it starts the desegregation of schools. And it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a little bit of time for this to happen, but this was a very important case. And Thurgood Marshall, who's actually the lawyer who argues for this case, will eventually be, he's a black man, Thurgood Marshall, he will become the first African-American Supreme Court justice down the line, not right now, but like he starts with this is where he gets his fame from. So this is a very important court case. Should have warned you that there's some graphic pictures on this, graphic picture on this slide. But 1955, so the year after this court case comes out, we have a brutal murder. And this is not the first brutal murder in U.S. history of an African American, but it becomes it has a broad, wide-ranging effect in the story of Emmett Till. So Emmett Till, young African-American boy, he was accused by a white woman of whistling at her, and and trying to like he's kind of trying to pick her up or something, and whistling at her, and her boyfriend and some other men kidnapped him and beat him, shot him in the face, and then threw him in a river and tied a big heavy electric fan to him and tried to weigh him down underwater. And he was found, and his mother was so furious about this event and just tired of all the brutality that she asked for an open casket wake and funeral. So we see down in this picture down here, this is the woman who accused him of whistling at her, and this is the open casket. And so these images and this trial, which the men were found not guilty because they said the state couldn't identify the body, and so therefore they couldn't be held accountable. So the men were set free after only a couple hours of jury deliberation. And on top of that, later on, the woman confessed and said this never happened. And so the country, a lot of people in the country were outraged by this story. So this is a really big deal in the beginning of the civil rights movement. As I said, desegregation doesn't happen overnight, and we see, in Little Rock, Arkansas, a lot of schools were fighting back against desegregation, and the high school in Little Rock was a prime example. And the Little Rock Nine, these 9 students decided they were going to desegregate Little Rock High School. You see, it's not easy. And these groups of people who are organizing race mixing as communism. So they're basically attributing living in mixed racial communities as communist. You see the hatred in the face here. This is the face of hatred, right? Spewing racial insults, spitting on the students as they were trying to get to school. And Dwight Eisenhower, unlike Andrew Jackson, back with the Cherokee, supports the Supreme Court case, and he sends in the National Guard to enforce desegregation. And so this is just now the government is backing it. And Eisenhower was a Republican, and so now we have both parties making moves at trying to desegregate the United States. All right, and this last event is the Montgomery bus boycott, which was started when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on the bus system. I have Claudette Colvin over here on the left. She actually did it before Rosa Parks. There's a lot of people who did this same thing before Rosa Parks, but there's a big difference here. I mean, one, Claudette Colvin was a teenager. They weren't sure if she would hold up to the rigors of being like the centerpiece of this movement, and like they'd have to ask her to get arrested, although she was already removed from the bus when she did it. She was also pregnant at the time, so therefore it was they chose somebody else. And so Rosa Parks was that martyr for the cause, and she was arrested that day. And that starts a protest, a boycott. This is the first time we see Martin Luther King on the scene. Here he is in his Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, was Martin Luther King's organization. They go down to Montgomery and they boycott the bus system. A boycott means you refuse to ride it or use their business. 80% of the bus patrons were African Americans, so they shut down the bus system. The bus system stopped making money. They carpooled, they rode bikes, they walked. They did everything but ride the buses. And in the end, the buses were desegregated. The Montgomery bus system collapses and basically says, fine, we'll give in, we'll desegregate. So this is another major victory in 1956. And it puts Martin Luther King on the map. And although it's just one city in the South, it gives people hope and makes people think, okay, we can organize nonviolently to bring about change, and we can do this on a larger scale. And so in the next lecture, we're going to get into the 1960s, and we're going to see how this expands and how Martin Luther King takes this message to the nation. And again, make sure if you go back through this lecture, make sure you get all these terms and the significance of what they are, and we'll move on to the next lecture as soon as you're done. Thanks.